From South Bend, Indiana, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
I think a lot of people are approaching additive because they think the lead times are inherent in casting, as opposed to thinking that there's an industry-wide capacity problem.
Okay.
So I see people sometimes wanting to 3D print something in metal, with powder bed fusion or something. And I'm like, it doesn't make sense to make a 50-pound valve in powder bed fusion rather than a casting, in my opinion, when the problem isn't the casting process. The casting process to do that might take 4 hours. It's that there's no foundries.
Yeah.
So
that was Sarah Jordan. Sarah is a metallurgical engineer and material scientist who is passionate about solving problems, process improvement, and process efficiency. She's worked in the metal additive manufacturing space since 2015. Sarah is currently focused on developing a new hybrid process called additive manufacturing evaporative casting, AMEC, at her company called Schooled. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. Also, if you or anyone in your company are looking for materials, qualification, or general additive manufacturing support, reach out to the team or through our website or email at info@3degreescompany.com. All right, Sarah, thank you so much for rejoining the podcast. You're the first repeat guest on the 3 Degrees discussion show.
Cool.
So I think if people want to check out your earlier episode, we kind of go into kind of your full history and kind of what you studied and things like that. But maybe just give like a 2-minute overview and then we'll kind of jump off from where Schooled is and all the cool developments you guys have been working on.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm a metallurgical engineer and I have a background in all of the kind of typical metals industry things: machining, heat treating, steel making, casting. And several years ago, my husband and I, we co-founded a company that we named Schooled after the Norse goddess of the future. And we are focused on developing and commercializing a new hybrid process that combines 3D printing with metal casting. It's based on what's called lost foam, which is a type of investment casting. So that's our main focus as a company.
And so maybe thinking back just even 2 years ago on the entrepreneurship journey, what's kind of changed in your mind? What's in terms of even just day to day? Are you is it what you've expected in terms of the zigs and zags of starting your own thing?
Well, no, things are never as you expect in entrepreneurship. I'm sure you know that. We've just made a lot of strides, even in just the past year. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes it doesn't seem like you're making progress, and you look back and you're like, "Oh, wait, well, we've gone a long ways." We always kind of joke that time in a startup is kind of like dog years, and that 1 month at a startup or 1 year at a startup is probably 7 years in a corporate job, and how fast you're moving and the things you're accomplishing. So some new things we're doing that have really helped us advance. We started in a program called Innovation Crossroads at Oak Ridge National Lab. Are you familiar with that program?
I'm a little bit, but maybe just give for anyone in the audience.
There's some other additive folks in it, SK Adi Guru. He went through that program, and there's a number of 3D printing companies that have gone through it. But basically, the Department of Energy has several what they call lab embedded entrepreneur programs at different national labs, and the one at Oak Ridge is called Innovation Crossroads. And what they do is they actually do several things. They pay the entrepreneur for 2 years, which is very helpful as a startup founder, as you might imagine. Having a baseline salary and health insurance is very helpful. They also give you a bunch of entrepreneurial support and training. We went through the Spark Clean Tech Accelerator at the University of Tennessee this past fall. and they give us like entrepreneurs and residents, advising support. And then the other big thing is they set up a CRADA with the national lab for $200,000. That's the DOE is paying Oak Ridge to help us advance the research in our technology. So this year, I think there were 7 companies that started last August, and they do this, like, I think it'll be the 8th cohort. Their finals are next month. So it's kind of this ongoing thing of bringing in new startups. And, Oak Ridge is really known for the MDF facility, the manufacturing demonstration facility. So that's why there's like a lot of additive companies that are in that program.
And you mentioned DOE. I mean, with your technology, where do you see some of the use cases, or where have you seen some of the adoption uptick with the work that you've been advancing over the last few years?
It's really all over the place. I mean, we right now are working on projects that are related to solar energy and designs for like solar like carports and things that are like just kind of a real breadth of things. Like I was just talking to people today about parts for hydropower turbines, and we've also had conversations on even simpler things like cast iron skillets. So it's like really a broad range of industries that are talking to us, some of which relate to clean power and some of them just all over the place.
What's kind of the pitch or the differentiator that you found resonates the most with the technology?
It depends a lot on who we're talking to, because we do have a couple of different technologies in addition to this additive technology. But the biggest thing is for things that are what I would consider low volume parts, less than say 1,000 pieces a year. You don't need tooling, right? So that's kind of the key thing. And then the other thing is the supply chains around castings are really difficult. One of the companies we were talking about earlier today, they were saying, well, even in their case, they actually did need tooling because they had high enough volumes that it was going to justify it. And they were like, well, it might still make sense to do it in this, regular lost foam, because their current lead times are 20 to 30 weeks.
Wow.
So it's not that the processes take that long. It's just like there's capacity problems.
And is that capacity here in the US to do that, or just is that a global problem?
I don't know if it's a global. I think it's definitely a domestic thing, and I think there's a big approach of a lot of people wanting to reshore things. And I heard a statistic. I don't know if this is accurate, but somebody told me this like the other day that something like 80% of the foundries closed in the past 30 years. And so like that is a huge problem.
That's right. That's yeah. And so what's the like with that, are people just accepting of the like lead times? That's kind of the status quo. Like people are they just not like, what are they like? Something's happened. Like, are they just not doing it anymore? Is it like,
I mean, I think a lot of people are approaching additive because they think the lead times are inherent in casting, as opposed to thinking that there's an industry-wide capacity problem.
okay.
So I see people sometimes wanting to like 3D print something in metal, with powder bed fusion or something. And I'm like, it doesn't make sense to make a 50-pound valve in powder bed fusion rather than a casting, in my opinion, when the problem isn't the casting process. The casting process to do that might take 4 hours. It's that there's no foundries.
Yeah.
So like solves the root cause of the problem.
Right. Right. Do you see activity on that front?
I mean, we're opening a place. I know a couple other places that are expanding, and I know one other company that's trying to open a new foundry as well, but I think there's definitely I don't know, what do they say? Workforce development. I think it's always the jargon. Like there's not a lot of people that know how to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a materials person. I don't know that you know how to open a foundry.
No.
You can probably figure it out. I'm sure you're
Right.
trainable, but I don't
Um,
know that that's on your bucket list either.
right. I mean, and especially if 80% of them close, like they kind of scatter to the wind, and Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
well, and if it's been over years and years, a lot of those people, yeah, they've retired. They're not somebody you can just reconstitute an industry easily.
right. Plus the infrastructure required, right, to get that
Yeah,
moving. I would imagine
yeah,
is not insignificant.
yeah. The infrastructure is an interesting thing because when we were trying to find a site for our new plant, like it takes a lot of electricity, but not a lot of floor space. So most of the places that had enough power
Uh,
were like million square foot, places. And I'm like, yeah, but I want this weird combination of a lot of electricity and like
right. I want
20,000
a
square
Jimmy
feet.
John's square foot like place that gives me that much wattage, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was like it's really an odd combination. And um it was hard to find. And the other thing that I learned well, maybe a year and a half ago, I was at electric vehicle conference, and I didn't know this, but the fast chargers, they take about the same amount of power, which I realized, like, I was like, that's going to be a huge problem. Like that
Yeah.
power doesn't exist.
Uh-huh. Interesting. And so, like, talk me through kind of the process of getting a new, like, kind of finding the building, getting permits, all of that fun stuff in terms of where you
Oh,
guys are at with
yeah.
that space. And what was the
Um,
goal, right? Like, I mean, we kind of talk about kind of the update of the company, right? Like, you guys have
yeah.
multiple customers, and
So we installed last year? Might have been the end of the 22, aluminum melting capacity in our prior, well, we're currently there, place. So it's like very small scale kind of R&D aluminum melting. So the goal has been for a while to install induction melting furnaces so we can melt steel, iron, nickel alloys, copper. Um, because that's where we were seeing most of the demand signals, most of the inquiries. So we started looking and like kind of like had this, you know, bucket list of like, hey, this is what the infrastructure, we wanted like, 15 to 30,000 square feet. We needed like 2,000 amps, which is a lot of electricity. Ideally we needed like cranes, you know, dock doors, things like that. And there's really not a lot of places. So like I was looking all over Ohio. I looked some in Tennessee because of being down at this Oak Ridge program. Um, and they're just not a lot of facilities. We eventually found one north of Dayton. And that ended up being its own adventure because what ended up happening, so we were going to lease originally, and this facility had it had fire suppression systems in it, like they'd installed, right? Because of what it was. It was like a laundry or something like that before.
Mhm.
And it was going to cost us something like $40,000 to rip out the fire suppression um, system in the ceiling, because you can't spray water over
yeah,
a melt
hot
furnace,
melt. Yeah.
right? Like, and it would set it off, and
Opening a foundry 101.
yeah, like
First rule.
no fire suppression systems, or like
Yeah.
not like sprinklers, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you want ways to put out fires, but you can't have a sprinkler system. Um, and so I was like, this is crazy to pay to remove something that's actually valuable to almost anyone else who would rent this building. Um, and then somebody like suggested to us, like, well, why don't you just go, you know, down the street, there's a foundry that closed. Like, why don't you buy that place? Like, why don't you like rent from that place? And we're like, there is. So we ended up kind of having to be a bit of I don't know, private investigator to figure out who owned this place that had been closed because it had been shut for so long. It really wasn't obvious. And so we tracked down the owners, and we actually, yeah, so we ended up buying this place because of that it had been a foundry. So that's ended up how we found this site that we're right now renovating to open.
That's
Um,
awesome.
the other thing you mentioned was permits.
Mm.
So that's also been an adventure. So there's lots of different kinds of permits, as we have learned, fire and occupancy and all these kinds of things. So we're definitely working very closely with the local government. And this new plant's going to be in Piqua, Ohio. So we've been working very closely with them, the county, on those kind of permitting things. Um, the EPA, we also have been working with. That actually has gone very well, and it took a bunch of meetings, but and math calculations to demonstrate the fact of lost foam being such a cleaner boundary process. So they eventually did agree with us that we did not need air or water permits for the initial capacity being installed. So that has been a good thing to kind of expedite things. It was a lot of work, but it's also a lot of work to get a Title V permit. So uh, that's where that is. If we expand in the future, we will actually need that. But right now, we are kind of considered de minimis.
And with your kind of current approach and size, you basically kind of, if you find a customer, they approach you, you're kind of working with them to develop the part and application, and you'll do it for them. Is that kind of the current model as you get um, more capacity and then the additional machines that you're building as well?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, sometimes people are wanting things that are already designed.
Hmm.
Maybe they're, low volume replacement parts, or it's really all over the map what these things are. So it depends on if it's going to get redesigned or not. So some things they're not. They're just like, this is the geometry. We want to make it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then some things, yeah, we will work closely. Like there's some companies we're working with on lightweighting around like vehicle parts to and I think that's a pretty typical additive approach, right? Like, okay, you want to redesign things to make it optimum for the process's capabilities. So some of the time we are doing that kind of application engineering.
And you mentioned the aluminum kind of part. Are there specific material families that you tend to work with more often than not?
Well, up to this point, we've mostly been doing a lot of aluminum just because it is easier to install aluminum capacity. But most of the demand signals have been around steels and a little bit in the nickel families, and then in the cast iron, ductile iron. Particularly the irons, like those aren't things that you can really make in the other additive processes because they just like I don't know if you could make wire in them, but you can't really make powder in them. They because of the microstructure that forms, and they're not real. They don't really like being welded anyways.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the reasons there's kind of a need in that space.
And one of the other, speaking of metals, I think it was right around the time that we had our first podcast. You started metallurgy Mondays, where you kind of do a kind of a mini deep dive into a special topic or kind of a news article or something that you've been reading about on LinkedIn. I've really enjoyed those. It's kind of
Thanks.
a cool like weekly thing I look forward to. But how have you found that? Has it been fun to do that? Is it kind of any kind of topics coming up that you want to cover or know that you're gonna kind of dig into?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, sometimes I'm learning in advance of writing things, or sometimes I'm verifying things. I'm like, I learned about this in undergrad, but it's been a while because I don't necessarily work in all these different areas. But it's been enjoyable. I think part of my goal in starting that was there's a lot of people that they don't necessarily have much knowledge on there, and I'd see things and I was like, that's totally wrong. People don't understand what's happening in this, given concept around materials or metals. You just see things on completely wrong. And of course, you can't be like, you would have an endless job if you had to correct, if you're like, had the goal of correcting everything you saw wrong on the internet. So uh, that is a futile process. So I was like, all right, we'll start an educational type of approach. And so that's why I had started it. And yeah, but it's been good. Sometimes it's very random and it's like last minute, like what I'd even decide to talk about. It yeah, it can just really vary, or if it's like, oh, like what's going on a holiday or something.
And so with that, I mean, one of the things like the AM industry has evolved quite a bit or changed. I mean, a lot of bigger companies struggling that had probably overzealous, to say the least, goals or promises that they had. There's a lot more conferences. You could probably be in an AM conference every week and on this. I mean, with your time in terms of how you are building a company, kind of doing the day-to-day stuff, developing new technologies, new applications, talking to customers. What's kind of your approach in terms of like a typical day and how you think about getting the message out about school and what you guys are working on?
Well, I don't think there's any common day. So for one thing, it was a startup person. So which is fits my personality fine. I had some routine jobs and that was not a good fit. But yeah, I mean, some of it's, yeah, answering customer inquiries, thinking about marketing approaches. Some of it's doing the technology itself. It's really all over the place and trying to advance the company and what we have going on. Um, we do like to go to conferences and try to get educational things about what we're doing out. I probably spend a couple, I don't know, probably on average a couple hours a day talking to new customers and just explaining what our process is even about, because a lot of times people I mean, they have to have figured out something. They've even approached us to say,
Yeah.
hey, they want to talk to us, but they don't necessarily understand what we're doing. Um, so sometimes they're coming at it from like, hey, they have a casting problem and they know they want a casting solution. And they're like, oh, great, this is maybe a good approach and they don't need tooling. Or there are people who are just, yeah, they need metal parts, or maybe they want an additive solution, different things. It's, yeah, pretty variable. I do like to go to conferences like AMUG's coming up, of course. That's my biased opinion, probably the funnest one. But we go to Mill AM and some years we've gone to Rapid and different places.
And going back to your conversation with customers, who, like in terms of roles or like the experience, like who are you first usually interacting with when like when a company reaches out to you or you're reaching out to a company? Is it supply chain folks? Is it engineers? Is it metallurgists? Like how are those initial conversations kind of starting?
I think it depends on the size of the organization. So, excuse me. For bigger organizations, I would definitely say it tends to be more on the engineering
Mhm.
folks. Every now and then it's a procurement person, but that's not super typical. And then even if that's the case, then we pretty quickly have to get the engineering people involved, because we're like, well, it's not cost effective to convert, your run of the mill green sand casting to our process. Like you know, you're going to pay more than
Yeah.
just, a sand casting. But like smaller companies, I would say a lot of times it's like the owner is the decision maker in all of these things, and they're maybe the ones that's kind of looking for solutions to their problems.
Mhm. And what's kind of the updates in the technology that you're working on kind of this year and going into kind of kind of future directions?
Yeah, so part of what we're doing with Oak Ridge is, and this is probably common to everybody in the additive space, is working on getting qualification data. So I think people assume that all the additive casting processes give you the exact same thing as, a traditional casting. And that may be true. But I think we should actually have data to show that is true, because the molding media is different.
Mhm.
Um, like we know, sorry, that we know the how this is forming with vaporizing the print is like the physics of it are different. Um, so we're trying to actually get enough data to say conclusively that, in given alloy families, that this is going to be the same steel as if you cast that same heat of steel in a different process. Um, so that's a lot of what we're doing with the Oak Ridge project is around that kind of qualification data.
And is that like A basis, B basis type of a lot of tensile bars?
Not exactly. So, um, So you kind of bring that up as like a MMPDS type
Right.
reference,
Right.
right? So because it's still a casting, generally speaking, the um MMPDS has a, I don't know if it's an exception, and I don't know if that's how I put it, but there is an equivalent way of qualifying materials that's in that document already, that's kind of designed for like if you're changing the casting media or you're changing a process somewhat.
Hmm.
So for that, like the guidance I've gotten from Battelle is that you basically need three three heats and 30 tensile samples across three heats, and as long as the properties are as good or better, then you can qualify by equivalence.
Okay.
Which makes things considerably easier than starting over. I mean, there's some more to it, and certainly we're going to look at some of the other properties, particularly like Fig and things like that. Um, but assuming that the data continues to show that, hey, you're getting the same thing, um, then that is kind of the approach that we would be taking. We're also working on a lot of alloys that aren't necessarily in MPDS because they're not necessarily aerospace alloys.
Hmm.
And a lot of those industries, like people don't necessarily have a formal way of doing it. Most of the casting specs don't actually tell you how to do the casting process, which I find pretty interesting. They And I don't know that this is every casting spec, but the ones that I've looked at, they tell you chemistry and they tell you NDT, how to test it, and they tell you mechanicals at the end, but they are really vague, and sometimes they don't say anything about the processing in between, which is super strange from the additive world.
Right. On the opposite side where
Like
they're trying to
there's
get
no
every
process
single,
control
right.
rules.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it goes to show. I mean, there's probably critical parts that have been, I mean, not qualified, but like they've got through that process, right? And like it's a little bit trusting, right?
I think they tend to freeze the process. I think it comes down to like if you went and asked 10 foundries how do they do something, they're all gonna have 10 different, slightly different ways, and they're all like, this is our secret sauce, and they don't wanna share it with
Yeah.
anybody. So I think part of it is like, how would they get all these foundries to agree to do something all the same way?
Yeah, that's a good point. Um,
But actually in machining, there's almost no industry standards too. So I don't know if you know this, I used to be a machining auditor for NADCAP.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I actually wrote the audit criteria for that back in the day. Back, I don't
Or
know.
like a facility level, like
So
qualification.
NADCAP is accreditation program for aerospace
Hmm.
suppliers. And so for machining, it's not conventional machining is a special process. It's primarily auditing landing gear and rotating engine components. When we were writing that checklist, this is like, I don't know, 2008, 2009, there were a few industry standard mil specs that had been obsoleted related to grinding. And that was it. Like
Hmm.
they're like the other stuff they controlled was all controlled by the primes themselves. They all had their own rules and specs and no one would share them, and it was super interesting.
Oh.
It sounds very like additive, right?
Right, right. Yeah, a lot of parallels right there. Um, Interesting. So I mean, as you look into kind of I mean, we're 3 months into the new year. What's exciting for you? What are you looking forward to, either from an industry level perspective, from what you're doing, the new facility? What's kind of on your radar?
Yeah, so our big focus right now is getting this new plant with the induction furnaces installed and up and running. We're targeting end of April, which I think is pretty aggressive. So hopefully it doesn't slip, but we're gonna have
Karaoke
to
party
kind
to
of,
open
well, maybe, yeah.
it?
That's so people are like, when's the grand opening party? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might have to do that. So yeah, that's a lot of things we have going on is around that. I mean, of course, I always like getting out there. meeting people at industry events, and then we're doing this credo with Oak Ridge National Lab. We have some other credos and some other projects we're working on. We have an SBIR right now that we're working on with the Marines. So yeah, definitely a lot of things going on.
Awesome. And I mean, since kind of we last talked, I mean, you're a couple more years under the entrepreneurship belt. Like, any piece of advice or new perspective that you would offer to kind of folks that are trying to walk the same path?
Yeah, I think probably lots of pieces of advice. Um, One of the things that people told me initially, and I didn't buy it at the time, but I buy it now, is that to like be all in. So originally, and I think we would be farther along if I had done that sooner. Because originally, like it was a side hustle while I had a day job.
Hmm.
And then even when I left working for Emerson, I was we were trying to bootstrap entirely. So I was still doing consulting. I was doing NADCAP audits. And so it was definitely, taking a lot of focus as opposed to, being, focused on it full time. And we've made a ton of progress, I think, since kind of changing that mindset and being like, okay, all in on this. Um, so I guess now I think those people that were telling me that, like, they were right, and I should have like listened to them sooner.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for the update, Sarah. Excited to hear all your progress and see what kind of the next few years bring as well. So when we hop on again for the next update.
All right. I look forward to seeing you in person some point soon.
Yeah, a couple weeks here at AMOG, right?
Right.
So perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
All right.